People in Boston take pride in the city's history, especially for trailblazing the path from British colony to national independence. But as with many American port cities, this history also includes chapters on the slave trade, as well as resulting efforts at freedom and equality. That part of Boston's history has become more visible thanks to port markers recently put in place on Long Wharf. To tell us about the project is our guest from one of its partners, the Director of Education and Interpretation for the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket, Lemerche Frazier. Thank you very much for being with us, Lemerche.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Lemerche, I want to have you go back a little bit on this because this project has taken a number of years and it's also part of a much broader story. Tell us about that context.
The project was actually started as a national recognition of Africans who have been brought to America's shores, kidnapped, and been enslaved here. The project was started and initiated by a woman whose name is Ann Chin, who lives in Jacksonville, Florida. By the way, that's where I'm from. But she is the executive director of this marker project that has had its markers placed in Richmond, Virginia, in places that were port cities that gave this appearance of now in 21st century benign space, but actually where enslaved Africans were brought in, like the 1619 project that also brought in the idea of what slavery was, what it has been. And so these markers help us to denote these places of African arrivals. Places like Jamestown, for instance, become marked by this. Jacksonville, Florida and its ports, and now Boston Harbor and its port. So we're looking at Boston Harbor at 1638 as the marker points to the evidence of the arrival of Africans who have been exchanged in the Caribbean, who were kidnapped from Africa, taken to the Caribbean, and then exchanged for native indigenous people, then brought back to Boston Harbor on a ship called the Desire. And we look at the marker for that marking.
I'm originally from Boston, and I grew up thinking that slavery here was a lot more marginal. Now looking at this exhibit, it seems a lot more central. How central was it?
Well, it's central and actually founds what America is built on. When we talk about the importation of people to the lands that mark what America becomes, 1638 is early in the founding, and it is operable in Boston, in the North, at that point. It has been in the Western Hemisphere already in the 1500s. But when we get to Boston's harbor, this is when it is instituted. And shortly after that, by 1641, it is legal by the body of liberties that have been created by John Winthrop and his group, writing these laws from 1634 to 1641. And so number 91 says there should be no slavery except one is captured or one sells oneself into slavery. And with that mark, Massachusetts becomes the first colony in America to adopt slavery legally.
I want to ask you about the presence of slavery in people's mind, because you might think that slavery was not a big economic factor here, but if you look at the triangle trade and see how it drives the creation of wealth, it starts to look more important. Can you explain that dynamic?
I think the mercantile activity on the water is what drives the economy, especially in port cities, as America is establishing itself. Its economy becomes that which ships help to create. And those people who are brought here on ships are helping this to be a burgeoning industry and is the driving force of economy here. When we talk about those who were involved as they are trading products across the waters. They are trading rum, cotton, all kind of products, and then people become a product, if you will. People who are insured just like any other commodity are insured, are part of this trade. And it is a lucrative business. The people who have time to write laws are only able to do that because they have other people doing the work. In this case, it is uncompensated work that is being done by people who are not paid for their labor. So when we look at this country and its foundations, as it speaks to the principles of democracy, we have some tensions here. As independence and freedom become the words, we have the winds of revolution that are happening in places like France and Haiti and America in these revolutions for freedom, yet there are those who are not free.
Well, as Ibram X. Kendi has pointed out, you can't have these material transactions around slavery without a narrative of supremacy. That must have been going on too, right?
Yes, when we look at the white possessive logic, is what I like to call it. And because white supremacy after a while kind of loses its meaning, we need to have some deeper understanding of what that means. You have people who have ownership by the theft of people and property. You have those who are being dispossessed of their property, who are a native indigenous people. And then you have people who are being deemed property, who are the Africans who are being brought here. So this relationship, our story is in the land. And the relationship of that land and its ownership to being able to build a nation is a part and parcel of how now we're trying to find these places to belong. But the marker itself is a mark of Black and indigenous people who have shared a history of over 500 years as we talk about this exchange of Africans for Native people. And then we talk about the marker taking you to the Boston Massacre and Crispus Attucks, whose mother is a Wampanoag Native person and his father an Ashanti from Ghana. You have this another intersectionality of African and indigenous people who have this onward going marching continuum to talk about their own freedom and gaining rights as we process this. So the marker gives us information and maps. I was working with Dr. Vivian Johnson on the content of what is on the marker and what you see. But as we created it, we did not want there to be an instance where a fifth grader is actually stunned by this, but can actually read it and understand it and follow a continuum of time that leads to the free Black community in Beacon Hill.
Well, maybe the most important thing to read here is that this is about people who are rejecting the narrative of supremacy and replacing it with a new narrative. One more example, Prince Hall. Tell us about him.
Yes, Prince Hall is one of the featured icons on the marker. And Prince Hall has been formerly enslaved here in Boston by a man named Hall. His manumission papers that are issued in 1770 say that Prince Hall was seen as a free man because he was able to negotiate his wages once a week for himself. And so by the time he was manumitted or freed from slavery, he is able to have his own business, his own soap making and leather dressing business. He organizes men like himself to participate in an organization, the first African Masonic Lodge, Lodge 459, that is used as an organizing principle to create community, to gain rights, to petition for what they needed, to be free people and to understand where they were. So his organizational skills, along with 66 other men, manifested in there also being an African society as a fund-making unit to actually include the women and children. And they're the people who purchased land from Myrtle Street on George Street, now down to Cambridge, where the African Meeting House resides and the A.B.L. Smith School. So they started this community on the basis of owning property and understanding what they would have to do to elevate their own presence here in America.
Speaking of elevating presence, one more important figure that we should hear about again, and that is Phyllis Wheatley. What about her?
Also featured on the market is Phyllis Wheatley. She arrives around 1750. She is, the Wheatleys in Boston know that there is a boat coming in with enslaved Africans that they can purchase. They want a girl servant. And so they see her, they purchase her. She's about 6 or 7 years old and has arrived from the Senegambia region in Africa where she was kidnapped. She grows up in the Wheatley home and is tutored along with one of their daughters. And by the age of 12, she has a propensity for languages. She speaks Wolof when she arrives in Boston, but by 6 months, she is speaking English. Her first poem is published by the age of 12. And so as she is in a family that receives guests who see her and are fascinated by her command of the English language and her ability to write, word gets around that she is there. And the Wheatleys are not able to get her poetry published as a manuscript in Boston. And there is a judge in London who hears about her, takes on that if she can prove she has written this work, she will publish her work in London. That happens. She appears on trial before 18 white men, ministers and scholars, including the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they pass her with flying colors. Her manuscript and she go to England, and her book gets published. And it is published in 1773, and the Museum of African American History has a first edition of that copy of the manuscript poems on various subjects, religious and moral. When we talk about these advents of literary history, of economic history, of the building of the muscle to be able to petition courts and to ask for funds to go back to Africa and or educate the children of a Black community that is building here, we have these instances that this marker will help us to understand that they came in by the sea. The other markers on this walk to the sea are different in that they are marking places where people walk to the sea. These Africans came in by the sea. So that is the presence of this marker will help us to understand the different kind of arrivals that happened.
And that's why it's at the far end of Long Wharf, closest to the sea. Thank you very much for sharing this with us.
Oh, you are so welcome. And I thank the committee and the National Park Service, the collaboration of the museum with them, the BRA, the city of Boston, Ruth Raphael for pushing the project forward, for Dr. Vivian Johnson, for Byron Russian, who is a former representative from Massachusetts, and others who were integral and critical to this happening. We really thank them for having the wherewithal to understand the connection that we needed in Boston to understand this history.
Well, thank you very much. That was Lamercy Frazier from the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket.